Welcome to HAWK MOOR, the unofficial history of Dungeons & Dragons, Greyhawk, Blackmore, Gary Gygax, and Dave Arneson. I am author, researcher, and game designer Kent David Kelly. If you enjoy this video series, please consider buying a PDF or paperback version of my book, HAWK MOOR, Book 1, The Dragon Rises. See the links below in my description for this video. This is Episode 5, Blackmore Origins, Part 1, covering the late 1960s and 1970. Welcome, friends, to the extremely complex and fog-enshrouded prehistory of the world of Blackmore, Part 1. As researchers and hardcore fans of Dungeons & Dragons know, it is extremely difficult to untangle the timelines relating to Dave Arneson's revolutionary original Blackmore campaign. While we have lots of historical documents and references to dates and events involving Gary Gygax, accurate materials pertaining to Arneson and his playgroup are much harder to find. The reason why this matters is because there were many court cases in which Arneson contested TSR's unfair withholding of royalties, which led to in-depth legal discussions of Dungeons & Dragons and its origins in both the Twin Cities Blackmore campaign and the Lake Geneva Greyhawk campaign. Both Gygax and Arneson insisted that their own game designs outside of the other man's contributions were key to the development and copyright of the multi-million-dollar Dungeons & Dragons franchise. The truth of the matter is that both men created the foundational materials that led to the publication of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. But there are many other important details to consider. For example, did Arneson derive his Blackmore rules from Gygax's and Perrin's chainmail? Or was the Twin Cities Braunstein game more integral to the foundation of role-playing? Did Blackmore begin in 1970 before chainmail? Or 1971 after chainmail? Did Arneson and Megory show Gygax and the Lake Geneva gamers how to play dungeon adventures in 1972 or in 1973? Did Arneson teach Gygax refereeing and game mastery, or did Gygax learn it from running Tullio Proni's War of the Empires game? These types of detailed questions are much easier to answer if we look at the actual documents and preserved court records where a lot of these questions were answered in detail, but not always perfectly correctly. I also recommend picking up the book Blackmore Foundations and also watching the documentary Secrets of Blackmore. Using these tools and many others, I set forth here a tentative chronology of the earliest Blackmore campaign, beginning in Braunstein, continuing through chainmail, and moving through the dungeon adventures beneath Blackmore Castle. If you have information that refutes anything I state herein, please let me know, because I am always open to being corrected, especially in a topic as labyrinthine and confusing as the timelines of Blackmore around 1970 and 1971. Let's dive in and see what the historical and court records actually show. I can 100% guarantee that you will learn something new from this video, regardless of how deeply immersed you are in the oldest of old school Blackmore and Greyhawk lore. And here we go. For the purposes of this timeline, although there are many potential beginnings, I open with January of 1968. This is when Arneson published his Corner of the Tabletop newsletter for all of his Twin Cities gaming friends. If you want to see the entire page of this newsletter, try going to Facebook and friending Secrets of Blackmore there. For this video, I will show a snippet of the 2-column newsletter, which you are welcome to read. Corner of the Tabletop number 1 shows that at the very beginning of 1968, Arneson's Twin Cities playgroup was deeply into wargaming, with particular interest in both Napoleonics and World War II. From a pre-Blackmore perspective, we can also see that gaming groups were splintering due to arguments over refereeing styles. This would convince Arneson that he would need to create a stronger game format in which a playgroup agreed to have one referee with player buy-in and with no undermined authority. This, in turn, would lead to the development of the Game Master concept, in which the referee deliberately holds back the details of many rules from the players to increase immersion, but also to prevent those potential rules lawyers from ruining the entire game. In the newsletter, we read, quote, "The Northern Wargaming Group have had to end their campaign. The reason given out by Mr. Arneson is that a few of the participants had completely undermined the authority of the referee who decides points of conflict to the point that all the other members decided to end it." A bit later, in August of 1968, Gary Gygax and others would found the Lake Geneva Wargames Convention, more commonly known as Gen Con. For pre-Blackmore concerns, this is critical because Gen Con would allow a future venue in which Gary, Dave, and their respective playgroups could mingle and share ideas. A young man named Mike Carr was here, and he would later become an editor and valuable intermediary between Arneson and Gygax. He was one of a few very important people who would become crucial to both the Twin Cities and Lake Geneva play circles. You might know Mike best from his epic starter dungeon module, B1, In Search of the Unknown. From about September 1968 to about June 1971, Arneson would attend the University of Minnesota as a history major. This is important to Blackmore because his interest in history, as well as political science, would lead him toward wanting to explore the medieval period in his own gaming. Gary and Dave would later feed off of each other's mutual interests to generate revolutionary game ideas in the years to come. In the spring of 1969, Arneson would begin his new era of the Game Master refereeing style with his huge and innovative Napoleonic simulation campaign. This time period is cited by Mike Carr in his 1974 article in the El Conquistador fanzine. This advanced wargaming campaign had many players and featured role-playing elements and improvisation. This campaign was crucial as an expression of Arneson's role as a game master and referee, allowing a wide array of requested player actions, an open design skill which he would later teach to Gygax. Gary would probably apply some of these lessons to his own emulation of Tullio Proni's War of the Empires science fiction campaign as well. In August of 1969, Gary and Dave would meet up at Gen Con 2. Arneson was into naval gaming and sailing ships miniatures, and the two men would agree to collaborate on a future wargame along with Mike Carr, which would later be entitled Don't Give Up the Ship. Here, Arneson would learn about integrating his own ideas with those of another co-creator, where collaboration would lead to enhancement and the meshing of two separate playstyles. This in turn would of course lead to Dungeons and Dragons in years to come. The Bronstein role-playing style, by the way, was innovated by David Wesley and loved by Dave Arneson and his playgroup and many others. Arneson would run with this Bronstein concept in many ways, for example, in a Viking game in the autumn of 1969. In this experiment, Dave Arneson, Bill Hoyt, and others ran a Viking-themed wargame scenario involving raids on an early medieval church and castle. This is one of the events that might be later termed a medieval Bronstein. Whether it was a wargame or a true Bronstein game is an open question. There may be a few glimmers of role-playing here. For example, there is a mention that the defender can gain points by eliminating enemy commanders via, quote, melee or assassination. And admittedly, it is difficult to imagine that there were hard and fast rules for stealth, infiltration, or assassination in a purely rules-driven wargame. Decisions were probably made during play. Similarly, there is a mention concerning allies that the defender players would have an option to gauge others' trustworthiness. As the rules would state, you may suffer if you accept them, and if you don't accept them, as full-fledged friends. Check out Secrets of Blackmore for more information on the Viking matter. In November of 1969, the Horror Incorporated creature feature movies begin playing on television, KSTP TV Channel 5 in the Twin Cities. This will become a favorite inspiration source for Dave Arneson and will later influence the fantastical and supernatural development of Blackmore elements. Also in late 1969 and throughout early 1970, several players joined Dave Arneson's Twin Cities playgroup. This would include Greg Svensson, who would later play the Great Svenny, arguably the most influential player character in the Blackmore adventure campaign. Around February 1970, Gary's colleague Jeff Perrin designed his own 4-page rule system for medieval wargaming. This rule set, sent to Gyax for his own consideration, would later become the foundation for Gyax's and Perrin's published medieval game, the Dungeons & Dragons predecessor known as Chainmail. Also at this time, Gary, with Jeff's permission, began revising the Perrin rule set. This will, in turn, become the Lake Geneva Playgroup's proposed method of play, the LGTSA Miniatures Rules. In early March of 1970, Gary and friends established the Castle and Crusade Society, or CNC. The Castle and Crusade Society is formed as a special interest group within the larger IFW, the International Federation of Wargaming. The court record states 1969 for this foundation event, but 1970 is generally agreed upon as the correction. As we read in the court record, quote, the main thrust of the CNC Society was the study of all aspects of the medieval period, especially arms, armor, heraldry, and miniature recreation of historic battles or modes of warfare. Note, too, that this aggressive counterclaim in the record presents the perspective that Gary Gygax authored Dungeons & Dragons, with no mention of Arneson as co-author. With a formal publication date of March 1st, around March 15th, 1970, the Castle and Crusade Society publishes and disseminates the Domesday Book newszine. This first issue announces the formation of the Medieval Special Interest Group, with Robert Kuntz I being listed as King of the Great Kingdom, where future medieval wargaming will take place. Also, around the beginning and spring of 1970, a game designer named Leonard Patt designed Rules for Middle-earth, which were rules allowing the New England Wargamers Association to play their own fantasy war games. And we must now also recognize the rise of the Great Kingdom. Probably in the spring and early summer of 1970, Gary designed the prototypical map of the Great Kingdom. As noted in the court record, this is, quote, a special map of a mythological continent upon which each noble or member of the Castle and Crusade Society had his fief or territory. You can find my deep dive on the various realms and regions of the Great Kingdom on my HAWK MOOR YouTube channel. If a request is made, I will post that link in the comments below. In early April of 1970, Domesday Book issue number 2 is published. This issue is only 2 pages. King Robert Kuntz I knights the first peer of the realm, that being Gary Gygax, 1st Earl of Walworth, of the Order of the Morning Star. On April 14th, Gary sends Dave Arneson a copy of Domesday Book number 3. I have note of a letter being sent as well on this date. The Castle and Crusade Society is now up to 8 members, including Sir Knight Jeff Perrin, but not yet listing Dave Arneson. In late April, Dave Arneson joins the CNC group. As we read in the court record, quote, Arneson was one of the first dozen or so persons to join the Castle and Crusade Society, and defendant Gygax and plaintiff Arneson corresponded occasionally regarding history and game topics, unquote. On August 22nd and 23rd, 1970, Gen Con 3 takes place. Here, Gary meets Don Lowry, the future publisher of Chainmail. Gary also meets David Megory, who will be the future designer of the Blackmore derivative board game Dungeons of Pasha Kata, which today is known as the classic game Dungeon with an exclamation point. Around early November 1970, Leonard Patt's Middle-earth fantasy wargame rules are published in The Courier. Around mid-November, Jeff Perrin receives his issue of The Courier with the Battle of the Pelennor Fields game, and perhaps Jeff shares this with Gary, or Gary receives the magazine on his own. Whatever happens, Gary certainly reads up on this system, and he will soon incorporate elements of it into his own upcoming game, Chainmail. In November and December 1970, Gary Gygax was working on his own draft of the upcoming Chainmail medieval wargaming rules. He was also adapting some fantasy rules drawn from the Middle-earth themed works of Mr. Leonard Patt. Gary was already at this time developing the very bad habit of not crediting where his ideas were coming from. In his mind, it seems, the writing was always his, so he was logically the author of the concepts. This ongoing, prideful theme would land Gary in court several times in the future, particularly with the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons fiasco of 1977, where he put his own name on the AD&D Monster Manual hardcover without any mention of his rival and co-creator, Dave Arneson. At the end of 1970 and in the beginning of 1971, Gary then planned on publishing Chainmail as playtesting with his Lake Geneva playgroup formalized the rules. As we read in the court record, to quote, Defendant Gygax made arrangements with Donald Lowry, head of the now-defunct Guidon Games firm, to become the miniature rules editor as well as a game designer. And in that capacity, Gygax prepared a manuscript for the medieval rules, including additional special rules for man-to-man combat with specialized different weapons and armor, a separate section for jousting, and a fantasy supplement to round out the work." Unquote. Jeff Perrin bows out as this chainmail fantasy supplement playtesting takes place on Gary's and Don Kay's sand table. Now, proceeding, I must note that in some narratives, December 1970 is cited as the time frame for when Dave Arneson's playgroup was running around in dungeon adventures beneath Castle Blackmore. But this time frame, in my opinion, cannot really be supported, as of now, without direct supporting period documentation, which might occur in December 1970. I realize my opinion on this point may anger some people, but there it is. Be that as it may, Blackmore would indeed appear in all its majesty and creativity very soon upon the horizon. We will explore that emergence and many other related chronological matters in a future episode of HAWK MOOR. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Stay tuned.